Emma lay in bed, her phone beside her, anxiously watching the time. It was 3:00 a.m. A time that felt too quiet, too still. The text from Jake a few hours ago lingered in her mind. "We need to talk." She had tried to sleep, tried to ignore the unease that had settled in her chest, but every second stretched longer than the last. Jake had promised to call her. He'd always said he'd call. It was supposed to be their routine, late-night talks, sharing thoughts across the distance. But now, silence. She couldn't recall the last time he'd called without her having to remind him. She stared at her phone, willing it to ring, her finger hovering over his contact. The phone lit up with a notification, her heart leaping. It was from Jake. Missed call. She didn't think, she just dialed back, her hands trembling, the phone almost slipping from her grip. Seconds dragged as she waited for him to pick up. Was it too late for him to answer? Was this the moment everything would change? After what felt like an eternity, the ringing stopped. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the line connected. Her heart hammered in her chest, unsure of what to expect. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice trembling. A long pause followed, and just as she thought he wasn't going to answer, Jake's voice came through the phone. But it wasn't the warmth she'd expected. It was cold, distant, almost detached. I'm sorry, I've been busy. I'll call you later, okay?" His words felt hollow, like he was saying them out of obligation. Emma's chest tightened, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. It didn't make sense. He promised to call. He always called. Why did everything feel different now? She wanted to ask him what was wrong, why he sounded so distant, but the words caught in her throat. Instead she just whispered, "Okay," before hanging up. The silence that followed felt suffocating, the emptiness pressing in from all sides. Emma sat in stunned silence, the phone still in her hand, her fingers gripping it, as if she might lose it forever. Jake's words echoed in her mind, but they didn't fit. They didn't make sense. "I've been busy." What could be more important than her? She could feel her chest tightening, the pressure of unanswered questions swelling. He had always been good at pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. But tonight something had changed. She leaned back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts tangled in a web of confusion and doubt. She had always been the one waiting, the one willing to give her all, but now the silence between them was suffocating. She stared at the dark ceiling, trying to recall their last conversation, trying to find some clue that would explain his sudden coldness. Why had he promised to call if he wasn't going to? It was like a knot, tightening in her stomach, and she felt the first crack in the foundation of their love. The silence in the room felt unbearable, like the air itself had thickened around her. Her phone was still warm in her hands, but it seemed like a lifeline to a person who no longer cared. She sat up slowly, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of it all. How could he do this? She had given him everything, her time, her energy, her heart, and in return she had received promises that now felt as fragile as glass. Her thoughts spiraled in the darkness, each unanswered call, every missed text becoming a weight she couldn't shake. She glanced at the clock again. 3:15 a.m. He was still asleep, wherever he was. Was she a fool to think they could make this work? She had trusted him with her heart, with her soul. And now she felt it slipping through her fingers. Was it over? Had it always been over? Her stomach twisted as the tears she had been holding back finally began to fall, one by one. Emma wiped her eyes and pulled herself together, forcing a shaky breath in and out. She couldn't stay in this space forever. She knew that, even though the emptiness felt like it might swallow her whole, she had to make a decision. Was she going to keep waiting? Could she keep waiting for someone who seemed to have forgotten her existence the moment the distance grew too much? Or was it time to face the reality she had been avoiding for so long, that maybe, just maybe, love wasn't enough when the other person wasn't willing to fight for it? She stared at her phone one last time, her fingers hovering over the screen. Should I call him? But she knew deep down that no amount of calls or texts would ever change the fact that Jake had let her go quietly, without a word. Her heart was breaking, But in that quiet, painful moment, Emma understood something. It was time to let go, no matter how hard it might be. Emma couldn't remember the last time she had felt this lost. Weeks had passed since Jake's last call, and each day felt like a battle with herself. She tried to bury the growing doubt, but it surfaced every time she thought about him. How could she continue to believe in a love that seemed to be slipping away, piece by piece? The more she clung to the hope that things would go back to normal, the more she felt the distance between them grow. She had waited for him so long, for his messages, his phone calls, the little things that used to feel so reassuring. But now those things seemed so distant, as if they belonged to a time that had already passed. Every attempt to reach out was met with silence. And the worst part was that Jake never seemed to notice her silence when it was her turn. The realization stung harder than any harsh words could. Sophie's words echoed in Emma's mind, but the truth was hard to swallow. "You're giving too much, Emma," Sophie had said when they spoke earlier that day. "You're the only one trying to make it work. You can't keep carrying it alone." Emma had dismissed the warning, but the more she thought about it, the more it started to sink in. She had always been the one who made the effort, the late-night texts, the thoughtful messages, the promises. But Jake never seemed to share her urgency, her need for connection. The silence in the relationship wasn't just in their conversations, it was in the space between the words. Each time she reached out, she was met with a quiet that weighed on her heart. She looked down at her phone again, her thumb hovering over Jake's name. She could feel the fatigue creeping in, the exhaustion of always being the one to initiate, to care. The evening sky outside Emma's window had faded to deep blue, the stars barely visible through the haze of city lights. She stared out at the horizon, wondering how far Jake was from her, both physically and emotionally. She had poured so much of herself into their relationship, her time, her love, her trust. But lately, it felt like she was just a shadow in his life, an afterthought. The more she tried to push away the doubt, the stronger it became. Every unanswered call, every silent night, fed her growing suspicion that perhaps the distance was too much for him to bear. Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. What if she wasn't enough for him anymore? What if, despite all her efforts, the love they shared wasn't enough to bridge the gap between them? She felt the weight of the thought settle in her chest, heavy and suffocating. "Maybe I'm just too naive," Emma whispered to herself. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but the words slipped from her lips before she could stop them. She had always believed that love would be enough, that somehow it would overcome every obstacle, every distance. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how much of the relationship had been one-sided. She had always been the one to wait, to hold on, to believe that things would work out. But what if they didn't? What if the love she'd fought for was just a fleeting dream, something that didn't exist anymore? She didn't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, her hope had started to fade, like the last light of a sunset disappearing behind the horizon. Sophie had been right. Emma couldn't keep living in the shadows of someone else's absence. She needed to stop pretending that everything was fine, that love could fix everything. She had given so much of herself, and it was time to ask herself why. She had sacrificed her peace of mind, her joy, all in the name of a love that was slowly fading. The truth was painful, but it was the truth nonetheless. She had to let go. She could feel it now, the stirring of a decision that had been brewing deep within her. She couldn't keep waiting for someone who wasn't going to show up. She deserved better. She needed to believe in herself again, to find the strength to walk away from the silence that had become too familiar. It wasn't easy, but it was time. The more Emma tried to ignore it, the more it consumed her thoughts. The silence between her and Jake had become a suffocating force. He hadn't answered her last few texts, and it felt like she was losing him bit by bit. She'd been patient, giving him space, but it was starting to feel like something deeper was at play. It wasn't just the distance anymore, it was the distance in his heart. She scrolled through their past messages, searching for a sign of the love they once had. But it wasn't there. The sweet words, the promises, the "I miss you," They had all faded into cold, distant exchanges. Every conversation with him now felt like pulling teeth. He'd be there for a moment, and then vanish, leaving her hanging. Was this the slow end of something that once felt so real? Was it time to face the truth? That love, no matter how strong, couldn't survive in silence. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to confront him, to demand some kind of answer. The uncertainty had been gnawing at her for days, turning her thoughts into a storm. "What's going on, Jake?" she texted, her fingers shaking as she hit send. She sat back in the chair, waiting for his response, her heart pounding in her chest. Every second felt like an eternity. When he finally replied, his response was as cold as the last. "I'm busy. I'll talk to you later." The words cut deep, each syllable like a blow to her heart. How was it that someone she loved so deeply could be so distant? Why didn't he understand how much she needed him to be present, to show up? But the coldness in his words was unmistakable. She couldn't keep doing this. It wasn't just the distance between them physically, but the distance he had placed between their hearts. Emma sank back onto her bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. The storm of emotions inside her threatened to overwhelm her, but there was no one around to help her weather it. She thought about Sophie's advice again. You deserve someone who will give you the same effort. It felt like a bitter truth, but it was the truth nonetheless. She had always been the one to put in the effort. She was the one who kept trying, even when it seemed like Jake wasn't making an effort at all. She'd been so wrapped up in waiting for him, hoping he'd change, that she'd lost sight of what she deserved. Why was she the only one fighting for this relationship? Every day felt like she was losing herself, trying to hold on to a love that wasn't coming back. What was the point in holding on to something if it wasn't real? And yet, the thought of letting go terrified her more than the thought of being alone. She knew what she had to do. It was the hardest thing she had ever had to admit to herself, but she couldn't keep pretending anymore. She had been holding on to hope, clutching at the remnants of a relationship that had long since faded. She had given so much of herself, so much of her love and time, but somewhere along the way, Jake had stopped trying. It wasn't just the silence, the unanswered messages, or the promises left unfulfilled. It was the realization that she had been living in a fantasy, holding on to something that wasn't real anymore. She had to face the truth. Jake wasn't coming back. He wasn't going to change, and no amount of waiting, of sacrificing her happiness, would make him realize that. As much as it hurt, Emma knew she had to start letting go. She had to stop waiting for a future that no longer existed. It was late, and Emma found herself standing by the window, her eyes fixed on the city lights outside. The distant glow seemed so far away, just like the love she had once shared with Jake. She didn't know what would come next, but she couldn't keep holding on to something that wasn't there. She had tried everything, waiting, reaching out, hoping. But it was clear now that she had to move on. She had to start living for herself again. The thought of leaving him behind terrified her, but it also felt like the only way forward. She had given so much, but now, for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like it was time to give something back to herself. Her peace, her joy, her strength. She couldn't keep living in limbo, holding on to a love that wasn't meant to be. It was time to step into the unknown, to start fresh, even if it meant leaving him behind. Emma had finally made peace with her decision. She had spent days trying to move on, blocking Jake's number, forcing herself not to check his social media. But as time passed, her heart began to heal. It wasn't easy, but she was starting to feel like herself again. That was until she found the photo. It had been buried under a sea of old messages, but there it was, a photo of Jake with a woman. She was standing next to him, her arm draped over his shoulder, a smile so intimate it made Emma's heart sink. The world around her seemed to stop as she stared at the image, trying to convince herself it wasn't real. Her hands trembled as she zoomed in. It wasn't just any woman, it was someone she had never seen before. The reality of it hit her hard. Jake had moved on. He had been seeing someone else while she had been waiting. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was physical, undeniable. She felt her breath catch in her throat as the truth started to sink in. Emma couldn't breathe. Her fingers shook as she tapped on the photo, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She wanted to believe it was some kind of mistake, that maybe it was an old photo or some random woman. But deep down she knew it wasn't. The date on the photo was recent, and the look on Jake's face told her everything she needed to know. He had moved on. And the worst part was that he had done it while she was still waiting, still holding on to hope. How could he do this to me? She thought. She had been so sure of him, so certain that their love was real. But now she felt like a fool. He had lied to her, pretending to be the man she thought he was, while secretly living a life she was completely excluded from. With shaking hands, Emma dialed his number. She wasn't going to stay silent anymore. She needed to know the truth, even if it shattered her once and for all. When Jake answered, his voice sounded distant, as if he had been expecting her call. "Emma," he said, his tone flat, "I didn't think you'd be calling." His words stung, and she could feel her chest tightening. She took a deep breath, fighting back the tears. "Who is she?" she demanded, her voice trembling. There was a long pause before Jake finally spoke. "It's not what you think, Em." The words didn't comfort her. They only made her more certain that something was wrong. She pressed on. "Then tell me. Who is she? Why was she with you?" Jake hesitated again, and when he finally spoke, his words were like a final blow. "She's someone I've been seeing. It's not that simple. I didn't want to hurt you." The confession hit her like a wrecking ball, tearing apart everything she thought she knew about their relationship. The man she had loved, the one she had trusted with everything, was a stranger now. She couldn't speak at first. The words caught in her throat, suffocating her. She had been holding on, thinking that love would be enough, thinking that if she just waited, everything would work out. But now, the truth was undeniable. Jake had been living a double life, lying to her, hiding the truth. "You were seeing her this whole time," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake's silence was enough of an answer. The betrayal wasn't just the relationship, it was the fact that she had given him her time, her love, all for nothing. "I thought you loved me," she continued, her voice shaking now. "But I guess I was wrong." His voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Emma. I never meant for it to go this far." The apology felt hollow, empty. He had already moved on, and she was left in the ruins of a relationship that no longer existed. "I can't do this anymore, Jake," Emma said, her voice breaking as she spoke. "You've hurt me enough. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me." She didn't wait for his response. She couldn't. She felt the final thread of hope snap inside her. The pain of the past few months, the unanswered calls, the silence, the growing distance, it all came crashing down in one overwhelming wave. "Goodbye," she whispered, pressing the end call button with shaky hands. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was a silence that brought some form of peace. She didn't have to wait for him anymore. She didn't have to wait for someone who had already left her behind. She could finally start moving on, even if it hurt. Even if it meant letting go of the love she had once believed in. The next few days were a blur of raw emotions. Emma tried to go on with her life, work, friends, anything to distract her from the heartache that weighed so heavily on her. But every time she closed her eyes, Jake's voice echoed in her head. She had tried to walk away, to heal, but the truth was harder to swallow than she had anticipated. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the loss of someone she had truly believed in, someone who had promised her the world. She had loved him with everything she had, and yet it felt like it wasn't enough. It never was. Late one evening, unable to sleep, Emma found herself staring at her phone again. She had deleted his number, unfollowed him on every social media platform, but still, she found herself wanting to reach out. But what would it solve? What was left to say? She had made peace with her decision, but a part of her was still clinging to the idea of him, to the idea of what they once had. That part of her needed closure. She needed to face him, face the man who had been both her greatest joy and her deepest sorrow. It was late when she finally made the decision. Emma reached for her phone, dialed Jake's number, and pressed the call button. Her heart was pounding as she waited for him to pick up. It felt like she was holding her breath, unsure of what would come next. When he answered, his voice sounded surprised, almost hesitant. "Emma." "Again." His voice was soft, but there was something in it, a mix of regret and something deeper. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady, though her chest felt tight. She had prepared herself for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she was ready. The silence stretched between them, and then Jake spoke. "I didn't want it to end this way," he said quietly. "I never meant to hurt you." Hearing those words felt like a slap in the face. She had heard them too many times before, promises that never held weight, words that never matched his actions. "You hurt me more than you'll ever know," Emma said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to stay calm. "But you don't get to make it right now, you've already destroyed it." "Why?" The word came out of her mouth before she could stop it, and it felt like the only question that mattered. "Why did you do this to me?" Jake was silent for a moment, and Emma could almost feel the distance between them widening with each passing second. She had always believed in him, believed that their love was something worth fighting for. But now she realized that she had been fighting alone. He had checked out long ago, and she had been too blind to see it. "I don't know," Jake said, his voice softer now, almost regretful. "I never meant to hurt you, Emma. I just got lost in everything, and before I knew it, I was too far gone." Emma closed her eyes, the tears she had been holding back finally falling. "Well, now we're both lost," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And it's over." The finality of the words hit her like a tidal wave, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like a release. There was nothing left to say. The love they had was gone, and it was time to walk away. The conversation ended with a quiet goodbye. Emma hung up the phone, but the weight of it didn't lift immediately. She stood there staring at the screen, her chest tight. For a moment, she wasn't sure what to do next. She had been waiting for this closure for so long, but now that she had it, it didn't feel as relieving as she thought it would. The truth was, she didn't need his apology. She didn't need him to make things right. What she needed was to find herself again. She had spent so long trying to hold on to something that wasn't meant for her, and now it was time to rebuild. She had to stop looking at the past and start focusing on the future. The love she had once felt for Jake was still there, but it was fading, and that was okay. She would be okay. With a deep breath, Emma turned away from the window, the first step towards healing beginning with her decision to let go. The next morning, Emma woke up with a heavy heart but a clearer mind. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that healing would take time, but she had taken the first step. She didn't have all the answers, and she wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew that she was no longer waiting for Jake to come back. She had released him, and in doing so, she had freed herself. For the first time in months, Emma felt like she was in control of her own life. The weight of the past was still there, but it didn't feel like it was crushing her anymore. There was still pain, but it wasn't all-consuming. As she stood by the window, looking out at the sunrise, Emma finally allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't defined by the love she had lost. She had finally found herself again. The days that followed were filled with small victories. Emma started to find herself again in the little things. The way the sun felt on her skin during her morning walks, the comfort of her favorite coffee shop, and the laughter of friends who reminded her of her strength. The ache in her chest wasn't gone, but it wasn't as sharp anymore. She had stopped waiting for Jake to reach out, stopped hoping he would suddenly show up and fix everything. She realized in time that it wasn't him who needed to change, it was her. She had to change. She had to reclaim her life, her happiness, her worth. Slowly but surely, the space that had once been filled with longing and sadness began to fill with something else. Something that felt like hope. Hope for the future. Hope for herself. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the emptiness crept back in, but Emma had learned to live with it. And each day, the emptiness became a little less loud, replaced by a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. Emma had always loved the ocean. There was something about the vastness of it, the way the waves crashed against the shore, that made her feel both small and infinite at the same time. It was here at the beach that she felt the weight of the past lift off her shoulders. She had come here on a whim, alone, and now as she stood with her toes in the sand, she felt the connection to something bigger than herself. For the first time in months, she felt free. Free from the pain of the past. Free from the weight of waiting for someone who never showed up. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore seemed to wash away the last remnants of her doubt. The ocean didn't care about her past. It didn't care about the things she had lost or the love that had broken her. It just was, and in that moment, so was she. She was whole again, even without Jake. Months had passed and Emma had begun to rebuild her life in ways she hadn't thought possible. She had taken up new hobbies, traveled to places she had always dreamed of visiting, and reconnected with friends who had always been there for her. She wasn't the same person she was when she first met Jake, and that was okay. The Emma who had once clung to the idea of love, to the belief that everything would be all right if she just waited long enough, was gone. And in her place was a woman who had learned the hard way that the only person she could rely on was herself. She wasn't angry anymore, not really. She was at peace. When she thought about Jake, it was with a quiet understanding. She had loved him, and for a time he had been everything to her. But that part of her life was over, and she had accepted that. She wasn't sure what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it. One evening, as Emma sat in her favorite cafe, sipping her drink and watching the world go by, she realized just how far she had come. It wasn't just the big moments, the trips she had taken, or the things she had accomplished. It was the small ones. The moments of peace. The quiet nights spent with a good book. The laughter of friends. The way the sun felt warm on her skin. She hadn't felt any of this while waiting for Jake. All those months spent holding on to someone who was never really there, and now she was finally living for herself. Emma didn't need validation from anyone else anymore. She had found her own worth. And in that, she had found a kind of happiness she never thought possible. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was hers. And for the first time, she was truly at peace with it. That night, as Emma walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had come a long way from the girl who had waited for someone who never came. She had learned to trust herself again, to love herself in ways she hadn't before. She had found strength in the moments of stillness, in the quiet days when she had let go of the past. She didn't need someone else to complete her. She was whole on her own. As she reached her apartment, Emma took a deep breath and smiled. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for it. The emptiness she had once felt no longer controlled her. She had made peace with it. And in that peace, she found her freedom. Emma stood at the window, the glow of the city lights casting a warm hue across her face. The apartment felt quiet, peaceful, a far cry from the storm of emotions that had once consumed her. The silence was no longer deafening, instead it was soothing, a sign that she had found peace. She had let go. She had faced the heartbreak, the betrayal, and the grief. And in doing so, she had come out stronger on the other side. And yet, even now, there were still moments when Jake would cross her mind. She'd think about what might have been, about the love they once shared. But it was just that, a memory. She wasn't waiting anymore. She wasn't holding on to what couldn't be. The phone, now sitting silently on her desk, had not buzzed with a message or call from him in weeks. And as the last month had passed, Emma realized something crucial. It wasn't just that Jake hadn't called. It was that she didn't need him to anymore. The phone remained silent. And she was okay with it. She was finally okay. The phone buzzed. It was the one sound that could still make her stomach drop. Her heart skipped as she picked it up, but when she saw the message, her breath caught in her throat. It was Jake. "I've been thinking about you." The words seemed to echo in her mind, and for a moment, everything from the past flooded back. The texts, the calls, the promises, all of it felt so close, so real, like it had just happened. But she knew better now. She had moved on. She had built a life without him. Her fingers hovered over the screen, unsure of what to do. Should she respond? Should she let him back in, even for a moment? No, not anymore. With one steady breath, Emma locked the phone and placed it down, walking away from it without another glance. She had let go, and she would not let his words drag her back into the past. She would not fall back into the trap of waiting. The days that followed felt like a final release. Emma continued with her life, walking down new paths she had once been too afraid to explore. She made new friends, embraced her passions, and found joy in things that didn't depend on anyone else. But still, there were moments. Quiet, soft moments when she would pause and remember. She remembered the way Jake's voice used to sound when he said her name, the laughter they shared, the little gestures that made her heart swell. It hurt. It always would. But now, it didn't define her. She was not who she had been in the past. She was stronger, freer, more in control of her own happiness. One evening, as she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sky turn from purple to blue, she realized that she no longer needed closure from Jake. She had already given herself all the closure she would ever need. She had said goodbye, not just to him but to the idea of waiting for something that wasn't meant to be. And then one day, Emma realized something. She had been waiting for Jake to come back, waiting for him to apologize, waiting for a love that had long since faded. But in the waiting, she had forgotten to live. She had forgotten that her life was hers to own, hers to create. She didn't need a reason to be happy. She didn't need someone else to validate her worth. She was enough, just as she was. The thought didn't come suddenly, nor was it accompanied by a dramatic revelation. It was simple. It was quiet. She had let go. Completely. She had forgiven herself for the mistakes, for the time wasted, for the love that wasn't reciprocated. And now, for the first time, she understood. There was no more waiting. She had already moved forward. Her life was her own. That night, as Emma lay in bed, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the finality. She wasn't bitter, but she wasn't naive either. She had loved, and she had lost, but in the process she had found herself. She had grown in ways she hadn't imagined, and though the road had been difficult, it had led her to a place of quiet strength. The phone, now sitting quietly on her nightstand, no longer held any power over her. It wasn't the phone she needed, it was her own voice, her own sense of worth. She turned off the light and closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she fell asleep without any lingering thoughts of him. It wasn't just an end to the relationship, it was an end to the waiting, the hoping, the wishing. And that, Emma realized, was the true beginning.